This will be the last source to watch to really understand the Supabase SSR package. Pinky promise. First, I'll explain the package, so you understand why it's actually a great deal, and then I'll show the usage with frameworks. Next.js App Router, Astro, Remix, all mocked with timecodes down below. Sounds good? Let's get started. Alright, so I have this project here, and I'll get started by installing the Supabase SSR package and the base package. And then to explain you what the Supabase SSR package does, I have both the Create Server Client and the Create Browser Client imported from that package, as well as the standard Supabase client. Let's start with the Create Browser Client. What does it do? It is very obvious that you will use this client in the front end, but it's far more interesting what it does. The Create Browser Client takes this standard Create client from Supabase.js and gives it the information how to read and write cookies with document.cookies. Still confusing? Let me show you. In the front end, to use Supabase, I only need to call the Create Browser Client and give it the API URL and the anonymous key. And then there's two essential things happening in the background. First, the Create Browser Client makes sure that no matter how often you call it, it will reuse the instance if you have already initiated a Create Browser Client before. So that's cool. And if you really want it, you can actually switch that off. There's an option object, and you can say is singleton false. And then it will create an actual new client all the time. But far more interesting is what happens in the background. Basically, what Create Browser Client does is something like this. It takes the standard client, provides it the API URL and the API key, and then the Create Browser Client will write this auth.storage option. Now, what is this? The standard Create client from the base package does not care where to get authentication data or where to save authentication data. It only needs to know how to get it and how to save it. So auth storage in the base client doesn't have anything to do with file storage. It's only the place where authentication data will be saved. And then what Create Browser Client will do is defining these setters and getters. So for example, when the user authenticates, the set item will be called, and the Create Browser Client will then have defined something like this: set the cookie on document cookie, so in the browser, and this is my key, this is my value, and so on and so forth. So this is why you only have to give the browser client two values, because it does the job to pass the auth.storage options in the browser for you. Here's the actual source code of that. Create Browser Client actually does a little bit more, because there's also browser limitations with regards to cookies. So if writing the complete cookie gets too big, the Create Browser Client also takes care of chunking the cookies into smaller pieces, and that's why you might see multiple Supabase cookies. So that's the browser client. Let's get rid of this one again. Okay, so now you understand that the browser client just uses document.cookies with Create client. And that's also the reason why you wouldn't be able to use this client on the server, because the server is no browser. Simple as that. But now let's answer the most common question. Why don't we have the same abstraction in the server client? Let's have a look how it works, and then I'll tell you. A Supabase server client is instantiated with Create Server Client. Same thing, we also provide URL and key, but then we need to pass also an object. And this object needs to contain a property called cookies. And now this cookies object needs two methods: set all to set cookies and get all to get all cookies. And this is a very simplified sample. So in the get all, you will return a list of cookies, and the rest will be done by the Create Server Client implementation. And in the set all, you get the cookies. For example, the user authenticates and then the cookies have to be set, and then you have to set them. And the most common question is, why do I have to do this? why can't cookieServerClient automatically read the cookies and then automatically set the cookies? And the answer is actually super simple. If all frameworks adhere to the same standard of setting response headers and request headers and would follow the same flow, this wouldn't be necessary, because then the implementation could be standardized. But unfortunately, every framework implements their own response request flow on the backend. And this is basically why cookieServerClient is asking you, hey, can you tell me how to get the cookies? Because I don't know. And the same for setAll. It goes like, here are the cookies. Can you please make sure that they're being set? Long story short, the cookieServerClient is framework independent and frameworks don't have an agreed standard on the backend. I'm pretty sure that helps understanding it, but let's jump to implementing it with Next.js. Let's kick it off with Next.js and start with client components. I want to read from the goats table to get the greatest of all time. So we'll use useEffect to trigger it when the component is mounted. Then I instantiate Supabase with the browser client. And then I select from the goats table. And I simply put the result.data into setGoats. Let's make a dirty one and fix the typing issue. Save that. And now you can see Supabase is the goat, so that worked. On the server, there's a few things to consider. Let's make this a server component now. Remove useClient, remove the useEffect and the state. Make our page an async function. And then use cookieServerClient. Now we need to pass the cookies object. And here it gets interesting. First we implement getAll. Getting cookies in a page is easy with the cookies utility from Next.js, but it's important that you grab the so-called cookie store directly in the component, such that Next.js knows this page uses cookies. So as you can see, we imported cookies from Next headers. And now we can simply return all cookies with return cookie store getAll. That was easy. But what about setAll? The page level in Next.js is basically the last layer of rendering. At this layer, you cannot set cookies. What I like to do here is just using setAll and then just do nothing. Now we need to make sure to grab the goats with await. And here we'll use goats data. And that works perfectly, but it's a bit annoying to write that all the time. Which is why we now move it to a utils directory and create a file cookieUtilsClient, copy all of that, and just make it into a reusable function. Perfect. Let's import it now. Clean up the first line. And now you have a one-liner client for your page components. Let's move to route handlers. And the fun thing is, you can kinda use the same cookieUtilsClient in a route handler. Let's check that. I'll create a new folder, API, with a new file route.ts. Now I import the Supabase cookies client, grab the goats data, and return it as a JSON. Let's see if that worked. Yes, it did work, but a route handler can certainly write cookies, and it must. Because if you have an authentication process, where you have a route handler as a callback URL, it needs to be able to write the authentication cookie. But the page files should never write cookies or Next.js will throw an error. So what to do? The fix is actually quite easy. Usually your page will not write a cookie. But if it does for a very weird reason, we catch the error and log it. So all we do is this. We use a try catch, we take the cookies to set, and we set each of the cookies with the help of the cookie store from Next.js. Easy fix. So we get the page covered and the route handler covered. There are two things missing: server actions and the middleware. But the server actions I don't have to show you because you can simply use the same cookieUtilsClient. So we got that already covered. Yet I have prepared a sample for you. In this client page, I'm simply triggering the goat action on click, and the goat action uses the cookieUtilsClient. Now if I click that one, we'll get the result. Now we're coming to the most important part, which is the middleware. Because you need the middleware to talk to Supabase to, for example, refresh the authentication cookie. Let me show you what you need to do to properly implement it. The middleware in Next.js is really important for Supabase such that we can do this. This will read the session, and if it needs to be refreshed, it will refresh the session. It's really important to do this in the middleware because if you wouldn't, then the page would try to set cookies and run in our try catch. So, can we simply do this? I would love to, but we cannot. And if you want to know why, the answer might be unsatisfying, but it's very simple. Next.js doesn't support setting the cookies with the cookies utility in the middleware. Instead, it follows a rather complex flow. But don't worry, we'll take care of that now. In the middleware, the Supabase client needs to modify the response object of Next.js, and it needs to do that in a way that will pass the changes onwards in the same request. That means if it writes a new cookie, it also needs to set that cookie for the immediately upcoming page render. And a good way to achieve this is the following. You create an object called ref, and this object contains a response object with next response next and the actual request data. This is very important to pass the request data onwards. At this point you might already ask yourself, why do we have to use this additional object? Why don't we set like let ref equals next response? And there's a very simple reason I do that. With an object like this, you can change the response value by changing ref.response, which means I could pass this object onwards to an external function, which then can modify the reference. So it just simplifies my life. And at the end, we have to make sure that we definitely return that response. Now we need to create the middleware client for Supabase for Next.js. I will just copy the one from the cookieUtils and then we'll adapt it. So how do we get the cookies? With the request object of Next.js, that's pretty simple. You do request cookies get all. That's it. The setting part is much more interesting. Now I need you to focus. The first part is this. It takes the cookies that we have to set and it sets them on the request object. So not on the response object, but actually in the request object. So we modify the existing request object to now also contain those cookies. The next step is this one. We take the reference where the current response is in and we override it with a new one. Why do we do that? Shouldn't it be enough that we actually manipulated the original request object? I actually digged very deep into the Next.js source code only to find an answer to that. And the reason is that the request object from the middleware is also used in the page, but it's a duplicate. It's a full copy, which means the only reason we set the cookies here is that we can pass it onwards to the page by modifying the next response object and then passing in our modified request, which will make sure that the page will get the modified request. And now comes the last bit where we actually, on that response object, set the cookies so we got it both ways, downwards to the page and backwards to the user, or more specifically the browser. And now let me explain the flow again. The request comes in, we create a next response object with that same request, unchanged. We create the Supabase client, which will be able to modify the response object. And then we call Supabase auth-get-session, which will trigger the Supabase client and make it potentially set cookies, so modify the response object. And then the potentially modified response object is returned. If it wasn't modified, it's just the original one that is returned. Hence, I want to emphasize that awaiting this is crucial, because if you don't await this, then it will just jump from here, create the client and not wait, and then just return the original object. I hope that brought some clarity to the Next.js implementation. So let's have a look at Remix. If you're in a regular component, it's really just a browser client, and we'll use useEffect. And then we fetch the data. Here we go, that works. For the server, there's only two options: actions and loaders. And actually, for both of them, it's the same approach. So let's load the data with a loader instead of the front end. We initialize a new server client. We need to pass getAll and setAll. GetAll, we read the cookies from the request, and the Supabase SSR package provides a parser for that string. So we return parse cookie header, and then we say request headers get cookie. And if it's empty, we fall back to an empty string. And to set the cookies, we use cookies to set for each. And now we have to set these cookies on a new headers object. So we create that headers object. And for each of the cookies, we add a set cookie header. And to make this a cookie string, you can use serialized cookie header from Supabase SSR. Then we fetch the actual data. Then you can simply return JSON, which is imported from remix run node, and go like codes.data. And as a second parameter, you need to add the headers. That's very important, such that potential cookies are being set. Then we use that loader data and see if it works. And yeah, it does work. And for remix actions, it's actually the same thing, with the only difference that this would be called action. You would also get the request, and this would be called action function args. So since it's basically the same, it really makes sense to put it into a reusable util file. Now let's check how we use it with Astro, which is probably the easiest one. The first thing you want to do is actually go to the Astro config m.js and make sure to put output to server. Otherwise, Astro will just do static generation, which means you wouldn't have a dynamic user session, so make sure this is set. Then let's start with the browser variant first. If you want to use it on the client side, you use the script tag, import create browser client from Supabase SSR. Then let's give this element an ID, fetch the data, and then write the result of that into that element. Super easy. But let's do that on the server now. Let's import create server client from Supabase SSR. Then we initialize it, but we also need to pass the cookies and the get all. And to get all cookies, you get a cookie request header and you parse that with parse cookie header from the Supabase package. And you fall back to an empty string in case the cookie header is empty. Setting cookies is super easy. We iterate through each of the cookies and we call Astro cookies set. That's it, and now we can fetch the data. And then all we need to do is to use that data. And that works damn fine. Let's now check how you would use it in the middleware. You create a new middleware file. You define export const on request, which is the middleware handler. And you get context and the next function. To use the Supabase client here, you would instantiate create server client. And the get all would be very similar to the page, but we wouldn't use Astro but context. And for the set all, same thing. We simply exchange Astro for context. And now we can check if that works by returning next. And before we do so, we grab some data. Then we have to make this async. And we console log the data. It doesn't immediately kick in because you have to rerun npm run dev. And now it works. But next to client usage, page and middleware, there's one more thing, and this is API routes. For example, we can create a test.json.ts, and this is an API route that will return JSON data. For example, like this. Let's test if the route works. We go to /test.json. That works, but now I'll make sure to remove the console log from the middleware so we can actually prove that our API route works. And now the cool thing is that the API route actually uses the same approach as the middleware. Let me show you. I've copy pasted. I import create server client and parse cookie header. But now we're missing this context variable, but this destructured object here is actually the context object. So as you can see, it's the same thing. Now let's fetch some data. Make this an async function. And then output it. Works perfect. So now you know how to use Supabase with Astro. Now you know how to use the Supabase SSR package, and if you liked the video, click on subscribe. And now I wish you a great day, great week, and stay friendly to each other. Cheers.